But I wanted to talk to you about something that doesn't feel real, you know?
Yeah.
And that has to do with what we talked about. I think it was 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, I had you on and we discussed the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson and the
Hmm.
Ukrainian counteroffensive around Kharkiv. Now, at the time, we made a lot of predictions, or we talked about like what was going on, and it feels like everything that we talked about immediately became worthless. Like I couldn't make a YouTube video out of it. I couldn't post any of it because by the time I would have posted it, all of it was out of date, all like everything. And
Yeah.
so my first question to you would be, reflecting on that conversation, how do you judge you and my both of our earlier predictions about this, like how this was gonna go?
I mean, honestly, I feel almost justified in gloating, about how well we did in that conversation. I mean, if you, go back and watch what we actually talked about, remember like how I said, oh, they might break through and reach the Oskil River, and that would lead to possibly the abandonment of Izium once the Ukrainians reach Kupiansk or like reach the bridges on the Oskil River. I mean, basically the only thing they outrun was my timeline on that. I was really happy with the analysis I did on that part. Remember how I said that, and you also suggested that, like on the month scale, we should look at Kherson, but on the week scale, on the scale of the of
Yes.
the of the week, we should look at Kharkiv. I think that like while we were still reserved about what could possibly happen, I think we kind of understood what the goal was. And okay, yeah, maybe we were off on the timeline,
We
but I,
didn't think it
but I
would be this successful though. Oh, I mean,
yeah,
we got general broad strokes, but I remember saying when you said, I mean, you said there's a small chance they take Kupiansk, and I remember saying, yeah, sure, right. I said like that was something I said, yeah, Kupiansk. Oh yeah, sure, that's cute. Okay, and they took it. They took it quickly. They took it very quickly.
yes,
They made Uzium an untenable position that
mhm,
became a Russian graveyard, which the Russians had already made a general graveyard, as we're finding out.
yeah,
And they withdrew from basically the entirety of the Kharkiv Oblast in a week, which we haven't seen that large swath capture of territory since the first weeks of the war. I mean, I remember Russian commentators talking about the fall of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk being like a general collapse of the Ukrainian army. That description, right, being used for that. If that was a general collapse of the Ukrainian army, this is this is like hell on earth for the Russian army in comparison.
yeah. No, that is true. I've seen quite a bit of decent analysis, which I kind of agree with as to what happened, why the Russians collapsed with the offensive at Izium. And I think it boils down to a few crucial factors that went wrong for them. Number one, it has to do with the fact that that front was lightly manned, and I mean, not that front, that area of the front, the area between Balaklia and Chalkovsky. Do you want me to turn the map on again?
I got a
I
map
can.
on my screen currently.
I can also live paint.
You can laugh at sure. Wow, look at this. We got a live
Yeah.
lecture. Okay, we can do that.
Yes, Mr. Live Painting himself. One moment.
Fantastic.
Du-du-du. Does that work?
Now let me just pop it out so I can full screen that. 1 second. Perfect. Okay, let me bring this up on screen.
Sweet.
Okay, we got your attention.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, there was this huge grouping, right, of Russian soldiers in Izium that were aimed at Barvinkova and Slovyansk. There was also a few smaller groupings at Kozachi Yelopan and aimed at Stary Saltov. Wait, back. They had these areas, and they relied to keep this flank. They relied on some tiny forces that were in Balaklia and Tchalkovske, and the rest of it they relied on this reservoir here to basically hold, and also the Seversky Donets River. So that was, wait, let me paint these in light blue. So here there was a water barrier, here there was a water barrier. So they hoped that this was an adequate, defensive position, and they basically ignored the buildup of Ukrainian troops here for an offensive. So basically, the Ukrainians built up a force of some three or so brigades, the 92nd Mechanized. They had elements of the 3rd Tank Brigade. So they organized the 93rd, 92nd, anyway, some mechanized and tank units, and then they basically attacked this whole area and broke through. So I mean I have basically blue balled my audience and whoever I've spoken to so many times on Ukrainian offensives. I've seen people be overhyped so many times. But from the moment that this started, I was yelling over like from the rooftops that this is a breakthrough, that they have successfully like broken through this area and they will likely be able to advance. Now, the reason why the Russians weren't able to respond, one part of it is command inflexibility. The Russian military is extremely top heavy, and decision making isn't very flexible on the ground. Instead, what happens is that you need to send approval to command, and command needs to decide what you're going to do. So, with things moving so quickly, you could be asking about,
Now, wait
direct.
for a moment. We
Yeah,
could let's just use that. Let's compare that to something else because some people might think that's how all militaries work. Other
no.
militaries make it easier for there to be more flexibility on the ground and for local commanders to make like kind of more local tactical decisions to change with as the situation changes. So let's say that a very good opportunity shows itself, it might allow it for a local commander to make a decision that wouldn't necessarily need to be immediately approved by like high top level command, or a lot where Russian military strategy doesn't really line up with that, and a lot of for other comparisons like the Syrian army doesn't line up with that, and a lot of Middle Eastern armies don't line up with that as well. They have more old style military tradition.
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily the age. I think it's the Stavka syndrome that the Russian army has. I think the Russian army is built around fighting a war, a conventional war, while being fully mobilized and conducting like very large offensives where individual actions of certain commanders could prove detrimental if they were out of line of an overall larger plan that they have no concept of. But this isn't that kind of war. The Russian army isn't mobilized, and flexibility of action is important when you have next to no mobile reserves, right? So, what happened is that mobile reserves really didn't exist neither in Veliki Burluk or Kupiansk. So, without these reserves, the Russians found themselves asking, what do we respond with? They had some units set up in Sevchenkove, but with the weight of this operation, they got overrun by the Ukrainians. So once that happened, they pretty quickly realized that what they need to respond somehow, send in something to stop, this Ukrainian advance before they cut off Izium. They didn't, for some reason, they decided against moving units from Izium up north because they hoped that some units from the north would come and plug the gap. So what they did is that they got the most mobile elements of that new army they had built, the 3rd Corps, and they sent the mobile elements down to block the road to Kupiansk. That was their main reaction in the beginning. And what happened is that those completely unprepared, basically lightly mechanized units got completely smashed by the tank spearhead of the Ukrainians. So now the Ukrainians are at the outskirts of Kupiansk and on the road to cut off Izium. So now I believe that Russia command decided that they didn't have enough strength to both hold any Ukrainian push towards Izium from the south while also using mobile units from Izium to counterattack and take back the territory. So wait, counterattack. Let me put it. Yeah, counterattack and take back the territory. Because if they could have deployed earlier to block the Ukrainians from, or if they had reserves in Kupiansk, they could probably have slowed them down enough to respond adequately, but they didn't. So with only reserves existing in Izium and any like reinforcements from Veliki Burluk basically getting smashed, they had no way to respond apart from deciding to cut their losses and flee. And the way they fled Izium, I mean, they left everything behind. They left like 40, 50 tanks, probably a brigade's worth of
Now,
equipment.
can I ask you a question? So,
Hmm.
the first question I have is, what do you think would have been a better thing for the way for the Russians to respond if there was a better option for them, right? If it was like a redeployment from Izium more northward to defend or something like that. And secondly, the Russians claim that this was a organized regrouping, that this was not a break, this was not them falling under the weight of a determined Ukrainian counteroffensive, but that this was an organized regrouping. We've seen that repeated on Russian state television and by, Russia supporters. What would you say about that, considering the amount of supplies that have been left and the amount of equipment that got stuck in rivers and was quite frankly openly abandoned?
Okay, I mean, there's always the idea that we can't exactly know what the plan is, right? We can't never exactly know what the Russians' original plan was. However, if this is supposed to be a planned retreat, there are certain aspects we can check for to see if it was organized. And leaving behind, dozens of command vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, trucks, and air defense systems, and even a TOS 1A. If you leave all this equipment behind, your retreat clearly wasn't planned. They wouldn't have left anything behind if it was a planned retreat. So I think we can dismiss that offhand. It wasn't a planned retreat. Now, as to what the Russians could have done um, to better react to this offensive, I mean, here's what I'll say. Let me zoom in a bit further to this area. Basically, if they didn't, kind of get caught completely off guard or freeze, I mean, if they hadn't gotten off, if they had realized that this buildup was significant and heading for an offensive by the Ukrainians, they could have probably built up their defenses in Balaklia, Tsalkovske, Shevchenkove, and basically braced for this attack. Well, they didn't do that. So let's get to the Ukrainians have just broken through our first line, from this area, and they've broken through here. How do we respond before they take Kupiansk? Well, the only real response the Russians could have done is considerably contract their bridgehead in Izium and pull out all spare units here to move north to hold Vesele here. And then hopefully use the roads to set up a defense at Kupiansk while completely writing off Shevchenkove and hoping that the third Army Corps also reinforces Kupiansk. That's what I think would be their only viable solution once the first breakthrough was achieved. But they didn't do that. They actually kind of fumbled their response. It was quite a fast offensive. They got caught napping, and that's what happens. Them's the breaks, as a famous UK politician once said. You know. So while there was a conceivable response for the Russians, they didn't take that option because I think they were somewhat bamboozled and unable to respond in time. That's
Now,
what I think
so Igor
happened.
Girkin and other Russian military Telegram channels and bloggers, the Russian military blogger class has become their own thing, really, their own class in this war. They were not completely silent about this region being understaffed, about the area not having the best, most well-equipped troops or the best trained troops. A lot of them not having a lot of experience. A lot of them just not having a ton of troops in this area to respond to something like this. Was this something that you think was really like a respected truth by like high command, or do you think this was something that was just kind of overlooked, or was this something that the Russians could have been a possibility?
I mean, mill bloggers were actually talking about a possible Ukrainian offensive in the area almost a month before it happened. So they saw it coming. So it would be odd to me to conceive that they saw it coming, but like Russian high command didn't see it coming entirely. Maybe they were, I don't know, maybe they were hopeful that they would bog down in the rivers or in Balaklia, that the units there would resist as harshly as possible and give them enough time to respond. Maybe they were caught in the middle of a transfer of equipment because we had seen the Third Army Corps. We had seen it in Crimea, I think. There were in Kherson. I mean, people were talking about where will the Third Army Corps go? Maybe it'll go to the south. Where will that army go? But somehow, on an on a day's notice, once the attack is taking place here, that army is, right to the north. How did they move, throughout this whole direction? Maybe they could have been heading to this direction and the Ukrainians got them early. But I can't tell you exactly why the Russians didn't respond. I mean, the Russian high command, I don't know what they were thinking in terms of this buildup here. Maybe they thought that the Air Force would cover for them, and any Ukrainian assault would fail due to the overwhelming Russian air power. But the problem is that the Russian Air Force is, it has been quite underwhelming this entire war.
I mean,
Generally,
it's
Mhm.
surprising. I mean, most commentators wouldn't have even believed that if you would have told somebody the first day of this war that 200 days in the Russians would, well, number one, if you would have said 200 days in alone, they would have said 200 what 200 days, you mean it's going to last that long? But then you would say 200 days in the Russians still don't have air superiority. That would have already been a shocking statement. um,
Mhm.
do you think the Russian Air Force has been underwhelming in its military performance generally compared to what people thought of it before the war,
It
or do
has
you think there were signs of its decay beforehand that more expert analysts noted?
Well, it has definitely been underwhelming. However, I think that a lot of analysts were expecting more of it in a different environment than what they're used to. So I don't think we've seen, I mean, to me, like the Russian Air Force is mostly risk averse. They are not willing to lose aircraft and trained pilots to in a large scale, on a large scale in Ukraine. They don't want to degrade their force completely. I mean, I've seen analysts talk about, in a potential war between China and Taiwan, that if the U.S. Air Force responded, they could lose up to 500 aircraft in an initial response. I think that people forget that modern air defenses, especially the ones that Russia and Ukraine are employing, are no joke. I think that we need to kind of study why the Russian Air Force is failing so badly, why it isn't able to bomb with impunity as it was able to do in Syria. And I think, to me, it comes down to competent and modern air defense systems, many of which the Russians are also using. So I think that, if anything, NATO militaries who should focus more on SEAD, I think they're called SEAD missions, which are anti-air defense missions and capabilities. Like the harm missiles, stuff like that. Because if there's ever to be a conventional war against a country that is armed with S-300s and S-400s, there's going to be losses. There's no two ways about it. I think so. I think that the Russian Air Force is largely risk averse, more than anything, and they're scared of losing a lot of planes and personnel, and they're not doing a good enough job in maintaining their air superiority, let alone air supremacy. They have air superiority over some parts of the front where there's less air defenses, but every time Ukraine shifts air defenses around, that area of the front will be given up, for example, and the Air Force will move to striking something else.
One second, I just got rid of got a better mic. I hope that helps with my audio quality on your side.
Oh
Um,
yeah, it's actually noticeably better.
I forgot to change it in Discord. So I wanted to ask. Somebody brought this up in chat, and this is a good point. Do you think a lot of this has to do with like on paper versus in reality? That the Russian army will say it has one thing on paper, or will say publicly that it has one thing, and then in reality, when like rubber hits the road, this isn't as well maintained as previously believed. The Moskva is something I don't know if you know of Laserpig, but Laserpig did a really good video recently about the Moskva and how it was not very well maintained. A lot of its systems didn't work properly, and a lot of like Russian military capability seemed to be almost like chest beating. And they have a lot of reserves, but is this equipment well maintained? Is it serviceable? And so my question would be: do you think any of this has to do with the idea that there's a Russian Air Force on paper, and then there's a Russian Air Force in reality?
I haven't seen the video by Laserpig just yet, but I'm aware of Laserpig. Uh, yeah, I mean, obviously, there's going to be a difference between what claims its capability to be and what their capability is. I mean, I think that much is obvious nowadays. Um, at the same time, I won't say that what I don't want to do when when doing analysis of the situation is use a lot of unquantifiable vectors in this whole situation. So obviously, there's going to be a percentage of corruption, bad maintenance, like poor military planning in the long term. But I want to I when Ukraine is making plans, I want them to assume that they'll be facing a competent Russian army with the capabilities it claims to have, because underestimating whatever opponent you face at whatever stage of the fight can prove really detrimental. We don't want Ukraine to be overconfident. We want them to be, grounded and plan whatever they do carefully. So yeah, obviously the Russians are going to be lying about a lot of their equipment, but I think that for the most part, I mean, Russian equipment and Ukrainian equipment is comparable. I mean, Ukraine. It was also like a relatively corrupt country. I mean, compared to say like Western European standards. So there's going to be things that I think the difference there is not going to be as enormous as people imagine.
So I want to ask specifically about uh, Russian media response to this, right? Because what's been interesting to me about this is Putin hasn't commented on this at all. He hasn't given a response. They haven't. They eventually gave like a public, the regrouping thing. But did you see Russian social media response to this? Did you see the initial Russian like state media response to this? Have you seen the difficulty we've seen with a lot of Russian state media and a lot of Russian commentators in being able to get like a consistent message? Some people trying to downplay the offensive, while others are saying that this is a real step back and maybe full mobilization is now needed, and others saying, oh, it's regrouping. Just like the all over the place response to this, how they didn't really know how to respond to this failing of the Russian military.
So I've seen, I mean, I mostly focus on, the internet and Twitter commentators. So for me, I've seen three main lines. I've seen the the state line repeater guy, the Koper guy, and the Strelkov Zoka line of guys. So I mean, the state line kind of guys, the no panic, everything went as planned. The cope guys will say that, oh yeah, this was a setback, but the Russians smashed the Ukrainians on the approach, and while they left Kharkiv, they'll be able to refocus those troops on taking a more important objective like Donetsk. And then there's the Girkin and Zoka crowd that basically understands that without mobilization, the Russian army doesn't really have a hope of ever. toppling the Ukrainian government, let alone achieve their like total goals in Ukraine.
So I wanted to ask about the idea of, well, on the approach in the Ukrainian army got smashed. There have been casualties in these offensives, and I do want to explain to people at home, for every Ukrainian victory, a lot of blood was given for those victories. But there's this idea that in the approach they got smashed to a point where, like, it's going to be difficult for Ukraine to do like other offensives, or like they really bloodied their nose, and while the Russians maintain minimal casualties. Like that was one of the most interesting lines that has been somewhat appealing to people. What would you say to something like that?
So I would say, I mean, specifically if we're talking about Kharkiv, probably the losses in terms of manpower weren't completely insane on either side. The Ukrainians likely lost some stuff in Kharkiv, but basically they blew through a very thin and weakly held line and forced a withdrawal from Izium. But the equipment losses that the Russians suffered were extremely significant. So I don't think they got smashed, because I saw how the Russian military bloggers were complaining about how, on approach, the Ukrainians were able to advance really quickly, and the Russian Air Force's response was really pitiful, that they weren't able to strike the columns and slow them down sufficiently. So um, yeah, to me, this wasn't the bloodiest offensive. It could have been way worse if they were facing stiff opposition. But no, the Ukrainians aren't smashed beyond their capability. Far from it. They probably sustained some casualties, and sometimes it kind of bothers me how a lot of people are extremely nebulous about Ukrainian losses. I mean, there's really, compared to how much people spend time tracking Russia's losses, and how much they're tracking, um, how much, yeah, there's a I mean, let me rephrase that. There's um, a lot of focus on how much Russia is suffering losses, as if this is an operation that Russia is successfully conducting, and it's the humiliation of how many people they've lost, instead of, oh, this is a war between apparently near peer combatants. Let's compare how those two forces fare. So people don't talk almost at all about Ukrainian forces and what damage they have sustained, and that times sometimes that will give us the perception that, the Ukrainian losses are extremely nebulous or almost non-existent. But I think that Ukraine has suffered quite a lot of losses in this whole war. They've likely lost way less equipment than the Russians, because the the equipment of the Russians is way greater in number, and their tactics and use with it has been way more frivolous. Uh, but at the same time, I don't think the Ukrainians have suffered catastrophic losses. But but pretending that they've been untouched or completely undamaged is kind of weird. I don't know.
So the next thing I wanted to ask about was, did the build up that occurred, was that noticed? Because of course the weakness was talked about. The weakness of the Russian lines here was talked about by military bloggers in advance. Izium, I mean, this is, and I do just want to take a second to say to chat that this is very significant. Izium, as I'm sure many people have heard about by now, was occupied for almost the entirety of the war. It's been occupied for 6 months, and so this is like the first big liberation of something that has been occupied for so long in this war, and we're really uncovering a lot of what Russian occupation is with these war crimes. But did anybody notice the buildup? How did such a significant buildup occur to the point where they could smash through this line with like no one noticing? I mean, they noticed that. I mean, the military bloggers noticed that the line here was weak, but what about the buildup? Because I remember being in, and I just got back from Kharkiv. While I was there, it was almost impossible to get interviews with soldiers because it felt like everybody that I wanted to interview was at the front fighting and putting the Russians back. So I mean, surely that you can't amass those many troops without it being noticed, can you?
So what I am guessing is that, well, the military bloggers did notice some of the buildup. I mean, from sources that I was looking at, they were talking about it for a while. But what I think happened is that probably there was complacency in Russian command, thinking that, oh, they don't have the means to go on such a rapid offensive. They won't have the equipment, whatever. I don't know exactly why the Russian command didn't respond. I can't tell you. I mean, the why they didn't respond after the offensive started maybe is more clear to me, but why they didn't respond before is less clear. Maybe they didn't have enough reserves. Maybe they were still moving the third Army Corps there to block. But honestly, I think that there was some buildup in the area, and then the Ukrainians were still holding some forces. So there was probably a like some buildup already in this area, and then the Ukrainians were holding some forces in adjacent areas, like maybe here, maybe closer to Chuhuiv. And then once the date was settled, they all basically moved rapidly to reinforce, not giving enough time for the Russian command to react before the big offensive happened. So they could have been basically they could have tricked them into thinking that, oh, buildup is still happening or whatever. I mean, that is, still a possibility. While, moving in the area quickly towards the end to not give them more than a day to respond to the attack. I can't tell you for sure, honestly, why the Russians didn't respond. I mean, to me they were probably unable to find the reserves just in time to plug the hole. I think that's the most plausible answer. And while it's very tempting to say that, oh, it's because they're dumb and blind. I mean, okay, whatever, but I can't go on assuming that they're always going to be dumb and blind. I'm going to try to find, the military explanation for it, because the dumb and blind explanation is unfalsifiable. You can use it all the time, and you aren't exactly doing analysis if you're using that explanation, unless you have proof, of course, which unfortunately nobody really has. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it.